All right. Hello, everyone. This and that. I'll be a little shorter today, partially because I had a lot of network problems. I'm going to finish with the remainder, the evening session or afternoon session of the Association of Heterodox Economics. And there was a session, a organized session of a variety of folks. It's sort of fascinating. Um, some from Bristol, some from Cambridge, some from other places, but they were trying to explain what the economist Tony Lawson said at Cambridge, and probably his best books are the ones attacking neoliberalism. This particular line of inquiry, and it has a very strange connection to, for example, John Searle at Berkeley, who has a social ontology project of some kind, and it does have all the usual kinds of academic issues. Searle is known as well, he's a philosopher, but for a while, he was the guy who talked about a certain brand of language philosophy, likely because he was at Oxford and uh, uh, worked on the ordinary language philosophy that was sort of brought through by J.L. Austin, which is at some level an extension of a certain variety of, uh, sort of the late Wittgenstein. So anyway, without dropping all those names, Searle, I actually, well, anyway, Searle was made fun of by the deconstructionists. More specifically, there's a book by Derrida where he essentially co-opts an entire an entire article by Searle by essentially including the entire text of the article in in his response. So he essentially appropriates Searle's article, makes fun of him. Anyway, the current position, I think, or one of the more recent research projects is a kind of social ontology that is not Marxist, is not deconstruct. In fact, I think Searle's still angry, but and then Searle's later life. I mean, I think he's already emeritus. He had one of those, sexual harassment suits leveled against him by one of his graduate students. So it's typical academia in that sense. So anyway, there is a there is a social ontology project. It's connected to Cambridge, and it connects with Tony Lawson's work. So all that has that kind of a tedious set of connections, and it is a kind of thing on moral philosophy. Ultimately, it gets to moral philosophy. It kind of wanders around. And why does it overlap with heterodox economics? Well, Tony Lawson, because of his original interest with that anti, sort of a post-Marxian, post-Cambridge capital controversy, sort of economic, tries to look at kinds of issues that are engaged in you could say a post-Keynesian kind of economics, a kind of critique of the entire system. Well, it's evolved into this thing because of various people um, to a discussion on something more generalized, and that is not on Marx, but covers something adjacent to Marx, which still makes it heterodox, and is a kind of theory called social positioning theory, which has its own textbook and a bunch of folks running around and as a research group, and it has this weird connection to Berkeley. So anyway, so the session included a bunch of folks, five people, so it was moderately well organized, I suppose. So it includes this first guy who talks about stop doing models, and it is a well, it's not so much an attack as it is a introduction to, um, and it also is supported by shameless self promotion in terms of a book on social positioning theory. lest you think that's unimportant, I think sociology has been casting about for new theories ever since structuration and reflexivity and a whole bunch of other little theories. So social theory has reached this particular strange point, and uh, and I don't think I put up the link. I'll put up the link. Uh, and I'll apologize for not hearing very well because I have a different headset on, and I may other issues may ensue. Anyway, so there's a book by this guy Yannick Slade Cafrel or Cafrel. Um, so it's a new book, very new book. It came out in April, but it tries to combine all of these things. The back note the back cover note is written with exceptional clarity. A conceptual framework, social positioning theory, is presented that at the level of social ontologies aims to explain the nature of social totalities. You know, the same social totalities that Marx talks about. It is essentially the same. It goes through lots of transformations. You know, Hegel, blah blah blah. Uh, but it is a consideration, and what's I think useful is, and this is where Searle comes in, is the idea that a lot of it does have sort of a moral philosophy or ethical philosophy questions. So that's where the kind of integration occurs. So you have essentially the connection of post-Keynesian or heterodox economics with a kind of ontology theory that comes via philosophy rather than sociology. So that's kind of where it is. And uh, is this useful? Who knows? But in so doing, many of the most challenging topics: emergence, irreducibility, collective intentionality, collective acceptance, and trust are considered, and important clarifications are provided a must read. So social positioning is a kind of extension on the theoretical side. And I would assume that some of the other things that are heterodox, that is, certain evolutionary game theory and other things, could actually work into this. So it could be that we're at the beginning of something very interesting. On the other hand, it could be the usual academic stuff. So that's fascinating, I hope. And I may have to get a copy of the text and actually do something on it. So there were 5 sessions on this. And yes, they've been working on it for a while. Tony Lawson's work covers some of this and kind of opens up the idea, largely because I think in response to the fact that the Cambridge capital theory just sort of it wasn't so much that it went nowhere. It's just that it had a lot of dead ends that required a lot of empirical work, which, suffers from the usual politics of trying to do empirical work. So the adjacent theoretical thing, which is Roy Bhaskar, which is critical realism. If you've read a little bit of Roy Bhaskar, you know that later on in his life he sort of finds God or finds spirit or something, and so he goes way off into some other vein. So that went somewhere. But Cambridge critical realism is also another useful idea in the sense that it asks, in terms of supporting the idea of radical activity or some sort of realism as a science, as addressing science, to because it does assume some of the same issues that actually come up in the history of thought. That It's an important thing to think about this idea of social ontology because it reflects on how scientists organize themselves. So it comes all the way back, if you want to triangulate it, to what Kuhn was talking about in terms of the community of scholars. So that's actually comes all the way back into this idea that, scientists work together, um, either together or not together, but they still form a kind of community. Certain anomalies come up and certain things called incommensurabilities, that is, contradictions, come up within the history of thought. That's kind of what Bellamy Foster does when he's talking about science from on the kind of materialist or Marxist side. That is, that there are certain positive things where you sort of assume a mechanical model of nature, or you assume certain things about nature that really aren't a good idea because scientists are still doing the work. So you could call it a sociology of knowledge, which is what Kuhn is sort of addressing. And you're looking at these anomalies, that is, things that become incommensurability. In other words, your data screws up, or your research screws up because the data is wrong, and the data is wrong because, for a whole variety of reasons. And it's Kuhn's work. I know I've gotten real far afield here. Kuhn's original work, which comes from his dissertation work, talks about the difference between a Ptolemaic view of the universe and a non-Ptolemaic or a Galilean view. Ptolemy versus Copernicus, then to Galileo, then to Newton, and then to Einstein. So that Einstein is working on something that was problematic for people stuck in kind of Newtonian, well, which exists at a certain level. It's not contradicted by Einstein. It just, it assumes a whole bunch of other new things. And that's kind of why still people are still taught Newtonian stuff and still need it to do some Einstein stuff. So it's not like there's a negation, a complete negation going on. Rather, it's some sort of transformation. It's all very Marxist or Hegelian, if you want to think about it. But no, think about it that way. So that's why uh, we're at ontology, whatever that means. So I know I've gotten you very far afield, but the project develops through two meetings: the Cambridge Realist Workshop and the Cambridge Social Ontology Group. The Cambridge Realist Workshop is a lecture series with speakers ranging from John Searle to Amartya Sen. And the Cambridge Social Ontology Group is an informal discussion group that takes place for 2 hours every Tuesday morning. The project has links to critical realism and the work of Roy Bhaskar. And so you have sustained direct engagement with John Searle and the Berkeley Social Ontology Group, aside from the minor or major scandal of John Searle. Needless to say, they didn't kick him out of Berkeley, and whatever the usual issues are. I think it's pretty clear that something happened and trouble occurred, and but he didn't lose his professorship or whatever, and he's emeritus now. So I think that happened amid all of this other stuff. And you can look it up on the internet. It's on the internet, so you can sort it out for yourself. So aside from scandal and dead ends and all this other stuff going on, academia continues in this way. Project starting point is an assessment of the widespread explanatory failure and general irrelevance or of the modern mainstream of economics. The explanation provided for this failure and irrelevance is that the ontological presuppositions of the dominant methodological approach employed by mainstream economists, that is, forms of mathematical modeling, you see, we finally got to the title, are demonstrably unrealistic in many meanings of the term. The modern dominant emphasis on various methods of mathematical modeling presupposes a ubiquity of closed systems of isolated atoms. Now, that's sort of overstating it, but Lawson kind of went there. The solution, then, if one wants to conduct social science successfully, is to employ methodological approaches that are consistent with the nature of the phenomena studied. Therefore, to inform such methodological choices, one must consider the nature of the phenomena that they seek to explain. And the problem, of course, is that you're dealing with humans. The project's aim, therefore, is sociology, studying in a systematic fashion the basic nature and structure of social reality. Now, the point is that this extends Bhaskar's work to assume that, science sort of goes on and it continues. Science is sort of out there and always working, and because reality is out there and it's sort of working. And it may be a more fruitful enterprise to sort of work out what is it that, and this is an extension of a bunch of other things, Bruno Latour and a bunch of other folks. What is it that scientists are? How is it that they engage the issue? And this is no different, I would assert, than Bellamy Foster talking in his a book on this, the sort of ecology, the sociology of ecology. Let's put it that way. The history of the sociology of scientific thought, more specifically in the role of materialism in the late 19th century and early 20th century, that there were all these Marxist scientists, and the fact is, stuff did happen, and the field of ecology essentially comes from uh, a integration of left scientists with other folks, and that's kind of what Bellamy Foster does in his book. Darn Soviets were interested in a more material approach, driven by Marx, et cetera, et cetera. And so you get this, shift in or a line of thought that, on the one hand, could involve espionage because there's a lot of leftists in the Oxbridge, sort of groupings of scientists. So that's a big problem. Became a problem ultimately, as we know from the history of the Cold War. So the issue of social ontology still is kind of important because you want to see how networks of scientists operate and networks of sort of things related to that. So it becomes this thing, which is probably a subfield for sociology because there are all fields that and with respect, I think this is something that probably got me into trouble somewhere. Overproduction of sociologists because of the the new left, and so they wound up in a lot of other departments. And I'm sure someone's going to do a piece on that, not me, but it is an interesting kind of fascinating problem that has, on the one hand, caused trouble. On the other hand, I think the history of thought, generally speaking, has moved to interesting places. But the fact is, some people, and I mentioned Theta Skopal because I confused her with what's her name. Anyway, that was a problem here, even though she was at the University of Chicago and had a ton of books already. Did they hate her because she was a woman? Did they hate her because she was sort of a leftist? Did they? It's all those, the same thing that Cornel West, the problem with Harvard that it's embarrassed that so much complicated thought come out of Harvard. But on the other hand, I think it's been a net bonus for in academia. But whatever. Usually have fascists in charge of the administration. Anyway, at the heart of the theory of social positioning is the thesis that novel social phenomena are everywhere constituted by or within processes which, through social abilities, that is, human communities, artifacts, language, education systems, etc., are formed or emerge. Through these processes, various, mostly pre-existing elements are rationally organized in ways why they are formed into components of the emergent totalities. It is the organization of these elements that is key to social constitution. There's a whole theory of constitution that occurs in sociology several decades ago. Anthony Giddens is part of that. And according to social positioning theory, all forms of social organization depend on processes of social positioning. And yes, this can relate to the professional managerial class, the critique of the PMC. A social position is a relational phenomenon which exists as part of a social totality that can be occupied. So, in general terms, processes of social positioning can be understood as involving two key features. The first is that within some social totality, a position is opened or otherwise becomes available. God, it sounds like academia. The second is that people or things come to occupy those positions, thereby forming components of that totality. So you can see how this resembles a sociological analysis of academia itself. You can apply social position to all sorts of stuff. And this is where they try and kind of position the social positioning. Our focus is institution, and the idea of constitution is also in the verb constitutive, and that applies in a whole bunch of other things. Human communities, these are the most basic social totality as all social phenomena are community relative. That is, you have groupings of people. We are born into some or other sets of communities, and in the modern world anyway, we interact as human beings only as participants in a number of communities. All coordinated human interactions take place in and depend fundamentally on the organizing structures of human communities. In communities, social positions are packages or sets of rights and obligations is the key element, understood as collectively accepted, permitted, and required ways of going on. Each right obligation that figures in the constitution of one position is matched to an obligation or right that figures in the constitution of typically, although not necessarily, a different position. Relations in the form of rights and obligations are power. Power over relation, rights, and obligations are grounded in the activities human beings. So power over relations is this relational question of hierarchy. It's the same hierarchy, with all due respect, and without talking at great length about the issues that Gramsci is talking about in terms of organic intellectuals, about hegemonic positions and all that other crap. So it kind of fits. These components are irreducible to the items out of which they are formed. They have relational features that the items or persons that occupy the positions do not. So what you're getting here is a way in which you connect certain sets of ideas among people, and that, of course, from an intellectual point of view, of course, at one level, you can see how people group together. And this is clearly so sociological. This goes back to, Domhoff on why the elite go to prep schools and then why they wind up in the Ivies and why they, run government. And lest you think that's unimportant, our entire espionage programs has been built out of people largely from either from the criminal class or from the Ivy League. So that's equally amusing. And I leave it to you to figure out, which one is more criminal than the other. Social, anyway, social positioning theory draws attention to these sort of errors, that is, errors within interpretive capabilities. And so in the case of money, because it'll get back to what we've been talking about earlier. Money is a component of the community's accounting system formed by way of allocating some kind of thing to a money position. The money position is constituted in terms of rights and obligations that bear on the uses to be made of any instance of the component so formed, to the effect that it is enabled and oriented to serving as a community general payment. In short, a community's money is identifiable as that kind of thing which is everywhere enabled to serve as a general means of payment, the latter property being its nominal essence or function, and money's nature or real essence is a set of rights and obligations of participants of the monetary community, in virtue of which the money so formed is enabled and oriented to serving this function. And without going too far into this, I think the example here is that, we talk pretty much every day about, what's his name, Lawrence Powell, the head of the Fed. We talk about Mango Mussolini, alias Trump, in terms of being the king of debt. So I think, is clear that we talk about rich people far too much, but we worry about what they're doing. So on the one side, we have villains. On the other side, we have what's her name? I can't remember her first name. Bezos's ex-wife, who is one of the biggest philanthropists in the world. So you have this entire sets of social positions, as it were. It's just that we have a new jargon, I suppose, a new labeling system for this activity. But the fact is, it can be useful if you want to think of sort of measuring rights and obligations as a way of talking about trust and reputation, which I think trust and reputation were the previous variables, and now we've sort of evolved over a couple of decades, I would hate to say, to rights and obligation. So there's something there. Trust and reputation are part of a whole variety of other things. Eleanor, the first woman Nobel Prize winner in economics, which shouldn't have been that way, but anyway, Ostrom talks about trust and reputation as one of these variables. So this kind of work occurred many decades ago, several decades ago. and now we see it evolve, I would assert, as if you're thinking about the history of ideas, to something called rights and obligations, which overlap in the big picture with that kind of codes of capital stuff. So actually, this all fits together, and yes, I think it does fit together. It is that we talk about uh, several decades ago things like human capital, social capital. All of these things still work back into our little left heterodox arguments. That is that maybe a kind of old wine and new bottle thing, but it is, I think, important because once you start talking about rather than trust connections or networks or reputational networks and get right down to the juridical questions of rights and obligations, you begin to see how those things fit together, and you can actually analyze things on that basis, which is useful up to a certain point. I mean, up to a certain point, you actually have to get down to empirical, got to get down to research, and I think that you can build maybe not something that is a perfect research program, but at least a more interesting research program that engages several different disciplines and is very heterodox in composition, and in fact is still part of economics. I mean, I think you could actually do all of those things, and ultimately, because it is about a certain kind of governance within economics, it's a it's political economy of a sort. Um, Okay, so I've yammered far too much, but let me swiftly go through the PowerPoints. I'm not going to read them just because, it'll get really ugly, but you have the thing. You can look at it yourself. So there's this one guy, um, the second guy in the presentation. He was pretty funny because undoubtedly he spent some time with Searle. Because if you know anything about Searle, he wanders all over the place. I mean, he he'll wander around the classroom. He'll just stalk around and keep yakking, and it's very amusing. And so this guy did the same damn thing. It was pretty funny, and I don't know whether he does it as a joke or whether he's sort of it's a pathological thing. But anyway, so he talks about ethics and a bunch of other stuff. Um, uh, a certain a conditional critique that underlies some of the ethical questions, and it addresses the mainstream of economics. So ultimately, it still gets back to that. The Cambridge thing, there's this guy Martins who essentially has tried to uh, 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 shoehorn the the ethical question into economics, and so that's kind of where the sort of critical ethical theory sort of comes out, and it has uh, this discussion of open normative order is more important, and so it goes to the moral philosophy questions that make this an interesting problem in language, in questions of trust. If you're a language philosopher, you get engaged to these moral questions, and they exist at a different logical level than the standard informal or formal logic. So there's a whole bunch of other questions that research-wise this can get into, which is actually really interesting. Because it does that, it engages a kind of uh, ethical or moral questions. It gets into Kantian questions and stuff about how law operates and stuff. That's kind of cool. So critical ethical naturalism is one of those things. I think it is ultimately still a way of putting a whole bunch of things together. But you can see, let's look at the basic tenets here, and I'll stop. I'll quickly browse through the other stuff. The tenets of a critical ethical naturalism would be that moral terms share the same reference, the things to which they refer, as non-moral terms. So you can see that this is a language philosophy problem where you're trying to work through, that you make a kind of performative thing about a certain action or activity, but you actually it can embrace within its semantic universe certain kind of moral positions. Critical highlights the essential role of critical reasoning in discerning paths to human actualization. Moral realism, truth of the matter regarding human flourishing. Moral claims possess inherent truth or falsehood independent of our subjective conceptions. In other words, appeals to common sense actually are not about common sense. Rather, they're about specific kinds of, if you will, liberal moral positions. So that's one thing. Humans intrinsically interrelated and socially constituted. This is that sociology thing about constitution. Aristotelian notions of eudaimonia as the good life and a social order where all flourish in their differences. In other words, a set of thing that is more responsive, I think, to a liberal order as opposed to all that conservative shit where we should all believe the same goddamn thing, so to speak. Openness as opposed to closure, ontological turn in ethics, similar to the one proposed in economics. So, uh, uh, this idea of quote unquote an ontological turn, the whole question of turns actually appears many different times in fields like philosophy. You have a materialistic turn from an idealism. You have uh, a linguistic term that is looking more at language philosophy. So there's a linguistic turn in philosophy, and in economics, you have a mathematical turn that makes everything done by mathematics and then ultimately game theory and all that other stuff. And then now you have an attempt by heterodox economics to move back to moral questions, which never left. Those questions were always there in economics. It's just they got shoved to the side, because nobody wants to teach the history of economic thought course, even though it's really necessary in economics, and in fact should be in part of every economics course. But whatever. So we have a turn backwards towards philosophy. So if you want to look at this sort of array of things that a good undergraduate economist should have to learn, it should be that there is a mathematical component, but then there's also a moral component, an ethical component, the thing that doesn't exist in business schools. For example, there are no business ethics courses. I mean, there are a couple here and there, but I don't think there's actually mandatory business ethics courses. So that's kind of where that goes. Is everyone still with me? Now you're all asleep. Let me stop there. uh, there's something about power relations and market methodology that was part of this, and actually tries to engage the thing about how uh, you have a CEO behavior, et cetera. He touches on institutional economics here, so that brings that back in. Veblen is one of those, the most important person, I suppose, if you were talking about institutional stuff. And then you have an actual, and I think this is the smartness of how they organize this stuff. A guy who does this made a presentation on how this fits more into business organization stuff, organizational purpose from a social positioning lens against a mind or collective intentionality. And it goes all crazy. It's about management theory, which is really kind of cool in one sense. You contrast Elon Musk's corporate purpose with the kind of functionalism, sort of base functionalism that you have with Henry Ford or Uncle Milty or whatever. Social positioning theory and the transformation of academic economics. So turning the lens on itself, this person raised a lot of interesting questions about, does AI should AI be used to assert, assessing the bodies of research? Can replace university lecturers and all that sort of thing. So it is a social positioning theory sort of problem. Okay, I will finally stop.
So, it's going to take me a while to grasp, the fullness of ontology. This social positioning, to me, it sounds like, another name for class.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah.
I'll be curious to find different, or what it adds to that.
Yeah, you could talk about class without having to mention Marx or Durkheim or whatever.
So is it one of the things that's sort of dawning on me? It's like this is a social positioning theory. And part of that is like these communities and these social relations that you're in. And it dawned on me, I was like, right now in my pocket, I have some money. I also have like a Wells Fargo debit card. And so
Yeah.
at this very moment, I'm in a social relation with Wells Fargo, I think,
Oh, yes.
even though I forget about that constantly all the time, but I am, you know, and it would
You
be
are a you're a subscriber to the bank.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think if people sort of knew, had some way of quantifying these relationships and, you would understand, oh shit, you know, right now, even while I'm sitting here, I've got this, huge relationship which is benefiting some giant corporation, right?
Indeed. Yeah, we got to
It's
keep
like,
all that money in our mattresses, right? Or whatever.
yeah, I think people would, sort of, if they knew that a little bit more, they'd be more likely to not be pro-capitalism kind of thing.
I well, we would rethink our relation to money. I think we should anyway, and we
Yeah,
do it anyway. We do have lots of bartering going on. We just don't like assigning monetary value to it. But on the other hand, if we don't, we'll be fucked. We have
yeah,
to really assess how we're using our time and our labor and our surplus value. Yeah.
right, yeah. Oh my.
That was a good insight, though. Thank you. I think that is the big question of credit and debt are the bigger issues.
Yeah.
And I guess we should read Graeber. I mean, the hell with it. We'll just, do all 500 pages.
I just want
I'm
to say
up for it.
no one should be in a social relationship with Wells Fargo.
Is it Wells or Fargo? You know?
Ugh. I mean, it's all the big banks are terrible, obviously, but that's really the worst of the worst.
Yeah, but then again, those of us who bank with smaller regional or local banks get screwed eventually. My bank has been bought 3 times.
Yep, that happened to me. I had that same bank from when I was a kid, um, and it was recently purchased by another larger bank, and then so I switched banks. But yeah,
How about a credit union?
Oh, there you go. That's also interesting. It is a moral position for most people who are at credit
There
unions.
are two credit unions in my town. And I have accounts at both of those. And I had one where I lived before. I had accounts at banks, and they just always did things that I thought were bad. So I opened an account at the credit union. And they don't get sold that way because they're owned by the members.
Yes, yes.
yep. I'm a member of a credit union as well.
These are all important elements. This is the difference between, it being individualized or being collectivized. And in fact, that's an important point, important element. And the role of private capital versus public capital. And, for example, a postal bank, if we expanded postal banks to be more like the European postal bank, we could, it would be more prosperous relative to controlling the kind of excesses of private banking.
I used to work with a guy who had, had some experience with Wells Fargo's back end, and they're
Ah,
not
yes.
professional. It's a shit show, apparently.
Oh God. I had, well, I've told this story before, but I was in charge of a little organization, and I had to meet with the bank, and it's just amazing how the bankers talk about what they do. It's just a little
Yeah,
scary.
yeah,
So anyway, I hope this was useful and interesting. I unfortunately dropped lots of names and little ideas, and if you have questions about that, please send me a note or talk to me in Discord. I'm happy to uh, disentangle this. I did include the link so that people could sort of figure out what was, maybe perhaps what was going on, but it takes a lot of mental energy to follow all this crap while you're, because simultaneously from the slide presentation, I'm making notes and copying, making slides. So it's all terrible and annoying. So anyway, let me bring this to a close, just because I screwed up on starting, and I shouldn't be a burden on these matters. But
Thank
let me
you.
just tell you that. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say thank you. This is a gift, appreciate what you're bringing.
Well, I like, it's the culmination of being stuck in academia too long or not long enough, and in certain cases, and it's just a fucking pain in the ass. And some people get lucky and they turn into stars, and other people just there's a lot of clerks in academia, and sometimes that's just going to be the death of academia itself. But anyway, that's what it is. I hope people will get something out of this. You may find it give a kind of approach to things, and the pejorative from any people in any discipline is that once you start talking about these social relations sort of thing, they kind of delimit what you're doing as quote unquote sociology, and as though the discipline could always remain kind of sacrosanct. And that just isn't the case. I mean, to quote a singer, we live in a material world. On that note, all right, it's time to go. I think we're not live streaming anymore. I think we're still, are we? Oh no, we're still streaming. I will
Still be
attempt
live.
to I got to kill everything. I will try and